You are eating less than you have eaten in years. You are tracking every meal, staying under your calorie target, feeling the hunger that tells you the deficit is real, and your waistline is not changing, or it is getting worse. Not on the scale, maybe, but in the way your clothes fit around the middle, in the hardness that sits right below your belly button, in the bloating that no amount of restriction seems to touch. You are doing everything the calorie model told you to do. And silently, without any warning signal your body sends you, the exact biological machinery designed to help you survive starvation is redirecting stored energy away from the places you want to lose it and toward the one deposit site that is most dangerous for your long-term health. The invisible villain here is not your discipline. Your discipline is real. The villain is a hormone called cortisol, not the kind you hear about in stress management podcasts, but a very specific metabolic function of cortisol that the mainstream nutrition industry has almost entirely failed to explain to the 40% of American adults who are currently in a chronic caloric deficit and wondering why visceral fat accumulation keeps accelerating instead of reversing. Here is what most people have never been told. Cortisol has a direct and documented relationship with a class of fat cells that behave completely differently from the fat sitting under your skin. Visceral fat, the fat packed inside your abdominal cavity, surrounding your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, is not passive storage. It is metabolically active tissue. It secretes hormones. It generates inflammatory signals. And it has a receptor density for cortisol that is roughly 4 times higher than the subcutaneous fat sitting just beneath your skin. This is the biological reason that aggressive caloric restriction, precisely the strategy most Americans over 50 are told to pursue, can trigger a measurable increase in visceral fat accumulation while simultaneously causing the body to preserve or even grow the most dangerous fat compartment in the body. Not because calories do not matter, they do, but because chronic caloric restriction is, by definition, a sustained physiological stressor, and sustained physiological stress produces sustained cortisol elevation, and visceral fat is exquisitely specifically molecularly designed to respond to cortisol by expanding. This is not a fringe claim. A 2018 study published in the journal Obesity Reviews, drawing on data from multiple clinical trials measuring cortisol levels and body composition changes in subjects undergoing caloric restriction, documented that subjects with the highest cortisol responses to caloric deficit showed the smallest reductions in visceral fat, and in a subset of the population, showed measurable visceral fat increases despite meaningful total body weight loss. The scale moved. The dangerous fat did not. In some cases, it went in the wrong direction. The researchers identified the cortisol receptor pathway in visceral adipocytes, the fat cells specifically inside the abdominal cavity, as the most likely mechanistic explanation. Let me walk you through the sequence in precise biological terms, because understanding it changes everything about how you approach a deficit. Your body has no way to distinguish between the stress of food scarcity, the kind that would have meant genuine survival risk for most of human history, and the stress of a deliberately chosen diet. From your hypothalamus's perspective, a 500-calorie daily deficit looks chemically identical to early famine. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, is the biological command chain that manages your stress response. When the HPA axis detects sustained caloric insufficiency, it signals the adrenal glands to produce more cortisol, not a spike, not a brief crisis response, a chronic, low-grade, persistent elevation that runs in the background of every hour of every day you stay in aggressive deficit. Think of it as the factory foreman receiving word that raw materials are running short. He does not shut the factory down. He reroutes production. He prioritizes the most critical outputs and begins diverting resources toward the most protected reserves. Cortisol performs this rerouting function in the body through 2 simultaneous pathways that almost no mainstream nutrition content has ever explained together. The first pathway is called glucocorticoid-induced adipogenesis in visceral tissue. Cortisol binds to glucocorticoid receptor, and remember, visceral fat has roughly 4 times the receptor density of subcutaneous fat, and activates a transcription factor called PPAR gamma. PPAR gamma is the master regulator of fat cell differentiation. When cortisol activates PPAR gamma inside visceral adipocytes, it promotes the generation of new fat cells in the visceral compartment and promotes the uptake and storage of triglycerides inside existing ones. Cortisol is not simply unlocking a door to let fat in. It is sending an instruction at the genetic level to build more rooms, stock them, and keep them full. This process was documented in detail by researchers at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research in Sydney, published in the journal Nature Medicine, who mapped exactly which transcriptional pathways cortisol activates in visceral versus subcutaneous fat cells and confirmed that the visceral response is categorically more aggressive. The second pathway runs through cortisol's relationship with a hormone most people in the fasting community have heard about in a different context: insulin. Cortisol directly reduces insulin sensitivity in peripheral tissues, muscles, and subcutaneous fat primarily, while simultaneously preserving and even increasing insulin sensitivity in visceral fat cells. This is not accidental. It is a survival mechanism. The body, operating under famine logic, is directing glucose away from tissues it considers metabolically optional under stress, and toward the visceral compartment it is trying to protect and stock for the assumed crisis ahead. The result is a biochemical environment in which the same insulin response that your muscles are becoming less responsive to is driving more glucose into visceral fat for storage. Reduced insulin sensitivity in the tissues, you want to use fat, and increased insulin sensitivity in the compartment, you are trying to shrink simultaneously from the same hormone signal. This mechanism was characterized in detail in a 2007 study published in the American Journal of Physiology, Endocrinology and Metabolism by researchers at the University of Edinburgh who mapped insulin receptor expression patterns across fat depots under varying cortisol conditions in human subjects. If you are over 50, this biological sequence is materially worse than the literature on younger subjects would suggest. Baseline cortisol levels rise with age. This has been confirmed in multiple longitudinal studies examining HPA axis function across decades, including a large cohort study from the MacArthur Research Network on successful aging that followed adults from their 40s through their 70s and documented a pattern of gradual HPA dysregulation producing chronically elevated cortisol in a substantial proportion of subjects after age 50. This means you are starting the caloric deficit process with a cortisol baseline that is already higher than it was in your 30s. Aggressive restriction adds cortisol on top of an already elevated foundation. The famine signal the HPA axis generates is landing on tissue that is already primed, already sensitized, already leaning toward the protective visceral storage response. There is something else running in parallel with the cortisol mechanism that the mainstream diet industry has consistently underemphasized, and it specifically compounds the visceral fat problem in a way that is invisible on any scale you own. When you cut calories aggressively, your body loses weight from multiple compartments: fat, water, and muscle. The muscle loss is not incidental. It is a programmed response to caloric insufficiency. Muscle tissue is metabolically expensive. It burns more calories at rest than any other tissue type. Under sustained caloric stress, the body begins to reduce metabolically expensive tissue as a conservation strategy. A 2013 study in the New England Journal of Medicine tracking body composition, changes across aggressive versus moderate caloric restriction programs, confirmed that subjects in the most aggressive deficit lost meaningfully more lean mass per pound of total weight lost compared to the moderate deficit group. The aggressive group lost more weight overall on the scale, but a significantly higher proportion of that weight came from muscle, not fat, and specifically not from visceral fat. Here is why losing muscle accelerates visceral fat accumulation over time. Muscle tissue is the body's primary disposal site for blood glucose. Every gram of muscle you carry is pulling glucose out of your bloodstream and burning it or storing it as glycogen. When you lose muscle, glucose disposal capacity falls. Blood glucose stays elevated longer after meals. The pancreas has to produce more insulin to manage that glucose load. Chronic hyperinsulinemia, the pattern of persistently elevated insulin that follows from reduced glucose disposal capacity, is one of the most potent independent drivers of visceral fat accumulation that the metabolic literature has identified. The American Diabetes Association published a position paper in 2020 specifically identifying hyperinsulinemia as a primary driver of visceral adiposity, distinct from total caloric intake. So the cascade looks like this. Aggressive deficit produces cortisol elevation. Cortisol elevation promotes visceral fat storage, and reduces muscle insulin sensitivity. Caloric restriction with high cortisol accelerates muscle loss. Muscle loss reduces glucose disposal. Reduced glucose disposal produces hyperinsulinemia, and hyperinsulinemia drives further visceral fat accumulation. At no point in this sequence did you eat too much. You ate too little, in the wrong biological context, in a way that made the exact outcome you were trying to prevent progressively more likely with each week of compliance. This is not a reason to abandon caloric awareness. It is a reason to understand the specific variables that determine whether a caloric deficit works with your biology or against it. In the next chapter, I will show you the precise hormonal sequence that separates a deficit that reduces visceral fat from one that expands it, including the specific threshold research that identifies how deep a deficit needs to be before the cortisol response crosses into the range that reliably triggers visceral fat protection. There is a number. It is not in any mainstream diet guide, and it changes the way you think about how aggressive your strategy should be. There is a threshold in caloric restriction research that almost nobody in the mainstream fitness or nutrition world talks about, not because it is obscure. It appears in the clinical obesity literature with enough consistency that any professional reading the primary research would encounter it, but because the entire commercial architecture of dieting is built around the idea that more restriction equals more results, and this threshold directly contradicts that premise in a way that makes it commercially inconvenient to emphasize. The threshold is approximately 750 calories below your total daily energy expenditure. Below that number, the evidence that a caloric deficit reduces visceral fat specifically, not total weight, not subcutaneous fat, but visceral fat, is reasonably consistent. Above that number, meaning deficits deeper than 750 calories per day, cortisol elevation in clinical measurements crosses into a range that researchers at the University of Colorado's Anschutz Medical Campus described in a 2015 paper in the International Journal of Obesity as the metabolic stress zone, a sustained HPA axis activation state in which visceral fat preservation and in some cases visceral fat accumulation occurs simultaneously with total body weight loss. The body is losing weight from the places that are least biologically defended and protecting the place that is most dangerous to your cardiovascular and metabolic health. 750 calories is not a magic number. It is the approximate boundary above which the cortisol response in the studies reviewed became consistently large enough to shift the hormonal environment toward visceral fat protection. Individual variation exists. People with higher baseline cortisol, which, as I described in Chapter 1, becomes more common after 50, may hit that cortisol threshold at a deficit considerably shallower than 750 calories. People with strong metabolic flexibility, lower baseline inflammation, and intact sleep architecture may tolerate a slightly deeper deficit without triggering the same protective response. But the direction of the biology is consistent across studies. Deeper restriction beyond that threshold produces progressively more cortisol. More cortisol means more visceral fat protection, and the dial between moderate deficit and aggressive deficit is not a dial that moves gradually. It crosses a threshold in a pattern researchers have described as step change, similar to what the Nature Metabolism paper on lipolysis gene expression described in the intermittent fasting literature. At a certain point, the body's interpretation of the situation shifts categorically from manageable energy gap to survival emergency. And when that shift happens, the machinery protecting visceral fat locks into a different operating mode entirely. Here is the part that I want to spend real time on, because it is the piece that mainstream nutrition content systematically fails to transmit. The cortisol visceral fat mechanism does not operate through calories alone. It operates through a hormonal cascade in which cortisol is just the first actor. The second actor is a hormone called neuropeptide Y, or NPY, which most Americans have never heard of despite it being one of the most potent appetite and fat distribution regulators the human body produces. NPY is released in the brain and peripherally in response to both stress and caloric deficit. Its function under those conditions is precisely targeted. It is not a general appetite stimulant in the way ghrelin, the hunger hormone most diet content mentions, is a general appetite stimulant. NPY has a specific documented preference for directing fat storage toward the visceral compartment. Research by Zofia Zukowska at Georgetown University published in the journal Nature Medicine in 2007, demonstrated that NPY released in response to stress directly stimulates the growth of new blood vessels inside visceral fat tissue, a process called angiogenesis, which expands the physical capacity of the visceral depot to store fat. It is not just that stress pushes more fat into existing visceral fat cells. Stress-driven NPY builds new infrastructure inside the visceral compartment to accommodate more storage. Zhukovska's team found that blocking the NPY receptor in their animal models virtually eliminated the stress-induced visceral fat expansion, even when total caloric intake and cortisol levels were held constant. The NPY pathway, not cortisol alone, was the primary construction crew. This mechanism is especially relevant for anyone over 50 because NPY receptor sensitivity does not decline with age the way many hormonal systems do. If anything, chronic low-grade stress, the kind that accumulates from decades of work pressure, poor sleep, inflammatory diet, and now an aggressive caloric deficit, primes the NPY system into a state of heightened reactivity. A 2019 review in Frontiers in Endocrinology examining NPY dysregulation in aging adults found elevated basal NPY activity in metabolically compromised older subjects and identified it as a contributing factor to the accelerated central adiposity accumulation that characterizes midlife weight gain in a way that simple caloric explanations cannot account for. You may have noticed something by now. I have described two entirely separate hormonal pathways: the cortisol PPAR gamma pathway, building new fat cell capacity in the visceral depot, and the NPY angiogenesis pathway, building new vascular infrastructure to feed it, and neither of them required you to eat a single extra calorie to operate. Both are triggered by the caloric restriction itself when that restriction crosses into the stress threshold. This is the biological explanation for something millions of Americans experience without having a framework to understand it: the phenomenon of losing weight on the scale while appearing to gain in the midsection, or of reaching a plateau in visible body composition change while total body weight continues to drop. The scale is measuring everything. The visceral compartment is not cooperating with the program. Now I want to introduce the third hormonal actor in this story, because without it, the picture is incomplete. That actor is adiponectin. Adiponectin is a hormone secreted exclusively by fat cells, specifically by healthy, well-functioning fat cells. And it does something that nothing else in the body does quite as effectively. It directly suppresses visceral fat expansion, improves insulin sensitivity in peripheral tissues, and reduces the inflammatory signaling that visceral fat generates when it is dysfunctional. Think of adiponectin as the regulator that keeps the visceral warehouse from overexpanding and from sending toxic signals into the portal circulation that reaches your liver. It is the brake on the system. The problem is that adiponectin is inversely suppressed by cortisol. As cortisol rises, adiponectin falls. This relationship was characterized by researchers at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm in a study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, examining the bidirectional relationship between HPA axis activity and adiponectin secretion across a population of subjects in varying metabolic states. The subjects with the highest cortisol to adiponectin ratios showed the most aggressive visceral fat accumulation over the measurement period. And critically, this relationship held even when controlling for total caloric intake. People eating the same number of calories were accumulating visceral fat at different rates based primarily on their cortisol to adiponectin ratio. When you run an aggressive caloric deficit and chronically elevate cortisol, you are simultaneously pressing the accelerator through NPY-driven infrastructure expansion and cortisol-driven fat cell proliferation, while cutting the brake line by suppressing adiponectin. The system has no counterforce operating. The visceral compartment expands under those conditions, not despite the deficit, but partially because of it. There is one more layer to this mechanism that lands with particular force for anyone over 50 who exercises regularly, and I want to address it because the exercise variable changes the calculation in a way that most fitness content misses entirely. Resistance training is one of the most effective tools for visceral fat reduction that exists in the non-pharmacological literature. The mechanism is well established. Muscle tissue generates its own adiponectin-like signaling molecules called myokines, particularly a myokine called irisin, that act directly on visceral adipocytes to promote fat oxidation and reduce inflammatory activity. A 2012 study published in Nature from a research group at Harvard Medical School led by Bruce Spiegelman identified irisin as a primary mediator of exercise-induced improvements in metabolic health, with specific documented effects on visceral fat gene expression patterns. The problem is that aggressive caloric restriction under high cortisol conditions suppresses irisin release from muscle tissue by two mechanisms. First, the muscle loss that accompanies deep deficits reduces the total mass of muscle available to produce irisin. Second, cortisol itself directly suppresses the expression of the gene that codes for PGC1 alpha, the transcription factor that drives irisin production in muscle. So the population most likely to be running both an aggressive deficit and a regular resistance training program is simultaneously creating the conditions that make their training's visceral fat benefit less effective, not through insufficient exercise effort, but through a hormonal environment that cortisol elevation from the deficit itself is creating. This is the mainstream betrayal moment I want to name directly. Every major American weight loss program, every commercial calorie tracking application, every hospital dietitian's handout that recommends a deficit of 1,000 calories per day, none of them include a mechanism-based explanation of the cortisol threshold, the NPY vascular expansion pathway, the adiponectin suppression cascade, or the cortisol-irisin interaction. These are not new findings. The Zukowska NPY research was published in 2007. The cortisol-adiponectin inverse relationship was characterized in peer-reviewed literature more than a decade ago. The irisin mechanism received the highest profile publication in Basic Science in 2012. The information has been sitting in the literature while the commercial diet industry continued issuing the same blanket instruction. Eat less, move more, stay in deficit. The failure to transmit mechanism-based nuance to the people who need it most is not an accident. It is a product of an industry optimized for simple, scalable, repeatable messaging, not for the biological precision that determines whether your strategy reaches its actual goal. I want to say something personal here because it gives this context a different kind of weight for me. After my own health crisis, the kind that arrived at 52 with no warning except a number on a blood panel that my doctor had been watching get worse for 3 years, I started reading the primary literature instead of the summary documents. I was not doing anything extraordinary. I was following every recommendation I had been given: caloric restriction, cardio, staying active. My visceral fat, as measured by DEXA scan, was not changing in proportion to the weight I was losing. My doctor called it a stubborn fat pattern. I went looking for the mechanism behind that phrase and found the cortisol literature, the NPY research, the adiponectin data. None of it was in the materials my physician had given me. The information was not missing from science. It was missing from the translation layer between science and the people it was supposed to help. That gap is what every video on this channel is trying to close. What you need is not a different calorie number. What you need is a framework that produces a deficit without crossing the cortisol threshold that turns the deficit against itself. In the final chapter, I will give you exactly that. The SAFE protocol, 3 specific adjustments, each with a precise number, that restructure your caloric approach in a way that preserves the energy deficit you need while specifically preventing the cortisol NPY adiponectin cascade from running the opposite program. And I will tell you the single most common mistake people make when they first attempt this adjustment. The one that feels like it should work and silently reinstates the exact hormonal pattern you are trying to avoid. The SAFE protocol has 3 components. Each one has a specific number attached to it. None of them ask you to eat more total food. All 3 work through the same underlying biological logic. Restructuring the caloric deficit so the body never interprets the energy gap as a survival emergency. The goal is not to eliminate the deficit. The goal is to produce the deficit in a hormonal context that keeps cortisol below the threshold, where it activates the NPY vascular expansion pathway and suppresses adiponectin. Below that threshold, a caloric deficit reduces visceral fat. Above it, the same deficit protects visceral fat while dismantling the lean tissue you need to keep metabolic rate intact. The S stands for sizing the deficit at or below 500 calories per day, not 750, not 1,000. 500. I want to be precise about why this number is lower than what the cortisol threshold literature identified in Chapter 2. The 750-calorie boundary from the University of Colorado research described the average threshold above which cortisol elevation became reliably problematic across a general population. For adults over 50, the effective threshold is meaningfully lower. A 2016 paper in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology examining dietary restriction and cortisol responses, specifically in adults over 50, found that the HPA axis reached a measurably elevated stress response at deficits closer to 500 calories in that age group than in younger subjects. The biological margin is smaller after 50. 500 calories is not the floor of effectiveness. It is the ceiling of safety for the population most affected by visceral fat accumulation and most vulnerable to cortisol-driven protection of it. The practical application is calculating your total daily energy expenditure with reasonable accuracy using the Mifflin-Seat-Gior equation, not the Harris-Benedict formula most online calculators still default to, and actual measured activity level across a full week. Subtract 500 from that number. That is your daily caloric target. Anchored to your specific biology, maintained precisely enough that the body never receives the sustained famine signal that activates the hormonal cascade you are trying to avoid. The A stands for anchoring protein at 1 gram per pound of target body weight daily, distributed across a minimum of 3 meals. Not total body weight, target body weight. This matters because using total body weight in someone with significant visceral fat overestimates the required protein load. Target body weight gives you the biologically appropriate dose without inflating it. The 1 gram per pound figure is consistent with a 2019 meta-analysis in the British Journal of Sports Medicine examining protein requirements for lean mass preservation during caloric restriction, which found older adults required protein at the higher end of the range studied, approximately 0.8 to 1.1 grams per pound of lean mass. To match the muscle-preserving effect younger subjects achieved at lower doses. The distribution across 3 meals is mechanistic, not a convenience recommendation. Muscle protein synthesis operates on a leucine threshold at each meal, not on total daily intake. A 2009 study by researchers at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, published in the Journal of Nutrition, confirmed that protein synthesis response in older adults was maximized at approximately 30 to 40 grams per meal and was not meaningfully increased by consuming more in a single sitting. Spreading 1 gram per pound of target body weight across 3 meals keeps the leucine threshold crossed at every meal, preserves glucose disposal capacity, and prevents cortisol-driven hyperinsulinemia from accelerating visceral fat storage. The F stands for fixing the eating window to end before 7 in the evening. Pancreatic beta cell function follows a circadian rhythm that peaks in the morning and declines progressively through the evening. The same meal consumed at 7 in the morning produces a smaller and shorter insulin response than the same meal consumed at 8 in the evening. Research from Sachin Panda's group at the Salk Institute, published in Cell Metabolism in 2019, found that late eating combined with impaired circadian insulin timing produced cortisol elevations the following morning that were meaningfully higher than what subjects produced after identical caloric intake consumed earlier in the day. For someone over 50 already operating with higher baseline cortisol, this nocturnal eating-driven cortisol amplification compounds the dietary restriction stress and pushes the hormonal environment further into visceral fat protection territory. Ending the eating window before 7 does not require a formal fasting protocol. It requires only that the last meal falls within the window where circadian insulin efficiency is still adequate to process it cleanly. The E stands for eliminating the 3 cortisol amplifiers most commonly present in the daily routines of Americans over 50 who are already doing everything else right. These 3 amplifiers each produce measurable cortisol elevation through independent pathways, meaning they stack on top of the deficit-driven cortisol load rather than substituting for it. The first is sleep duration below 7 hours. A 2012 study in the Annals of Internal Medicine by researchers at the University of Chicago, led by Plum and Panev, tracked body composition changes under identical caloric restriction with adequate sleep averaging 8.5 hours, versus restricted sleep averaging 5.5 hours. The adequate sleep group lost 55% of their weight loss from fat. The sleep-restricted group lost only 25% from fat, with the remainder coming from lean mass. Cortisol and ghrelin both elevated significantly in the sleep-restricted group, consistent with the NPY visceral fat pathway described in Chapter 2. The second amplifier is caffeine consumed in the first 90 minutes after waking for the cortisol awakening response amplification documented in circadian biology research. This is not an argument to eliminate coffee. It is an argument to delay it until the cortisol awakening response has peaked and begun its natural descent, 90 minutes from the moment of waking. The cortisol amplification